My great pleasure to present a panel on a topic that many of us have been thinking about and talking about for a long time, but many of us have been thinking and talking about entirely different concepts about what might or might not or should not happen about Prop 13. So tonight I hope that you will gain from the panelists a lot of information about what Prop 13 does, what it was meant to do, what it's actually doing, what people are talking about doing to it, with it, or leaving it alone. And we have three wonderful panelists. I say that because I chose them, but I chose them because they're wonderful. Lenny Goldberg, who's standing up because he's going to be the first presenter, and he's one of those always ready kind of guys, is the Executive Director of the California Tax Reform Association and a principal in his own firm, Lenny Goldberg and Associates. He's been involved with virtually every piece of major tax legislation in California over the past 25 years. He was a member of the California Commission on Tax Policy in the New Economy. He sits on the advisory boards for the Franchise Tax Board and the Board of Equalization. He publishes regularly on tax policy as a correspondent for 10 years for State Tax Notes and a number of other publications. He is considered around this state a leading expert on all aspects of Prop 13 and other aspects of tax reform, about which his writings and research are available if you should want to read all of them, if you've got a month to spare, at www.caltaxreform.org. He's also on the board of Citizens for Tax Justice. Lenny's been involved with statewide policy issues as well concerning energy, consumer issues, privacy, housing, and human services over the last 25 years. He was previously a legislative staffer, we don't hold that against him, and chief consultant of the Assembly Human Services Committee. He's taught at UC Berkeley, Cal State University San Francisco, and USC in Sacramento. He has degrees in economics from Williams College and the University of California at Berkeley. Our second presenter, Jennifer Ito, is a project manager at the USC Program for Environmental and Regional Equity, which is a research organization that conducts research and facilitates discussions on issues of environmental justice, regional inclusion, and social movement building. She's co-authored several publications on social movements. Prior to joining the program at USC, Jennifer worked for Strategic Concepts in Organizing and Policy Education, which many of you know as SCOPE, which is a grassroots organizing and movement building organization based in South LA. As research director, her areas of focus included clean energy, economic and workforce development policy, and tax and fiscal policy reform. She was appointed by the California Assembly to serve on the California Commission on the 21st Century Economy, and currently serves on the boards of the Economic Roundtable and the California Budget Project. She holds a master's in urban planning from UCLA. Our final panelist, many of you may know, Michele Pritchard. She's now the director of the Common Agenda program at the Liberty Hill Foundation, as Liberty Hill's executive director from 1989 to 1997. And we've got three Liberty Hill executive directors here tonight. How cool. But Michele is on the panel, so I'll introduce her. She helped to create grant programs addressing poverty, racial justice, and environmental health. She served in a leadership capacity for the California Health and Environmental Funders Network, the LA Urban Funders, the Southern California Association for Philanthropy, the Funding Exchange, and the Working Group on Labor and Community. Last year, she received the Distinguished Service Award from the Council on Foundations, which is that association's highest honor. Michele's a member of the board of directors of the Venice Community Housing Corporation and Green LA. She was appointed by Mayor Villaraigosa in 2011 to the board of the Harbor Community Benefit Foundation, which is a nonprofit dedicated to improving the port communities of Wilmington and San Pedro, California. Since last year, she served as senior advisor to California Calls, a statewide alliance of social justice organizations, which is working to advance tax and fiscal policy reform through voter engagement. She has served as a senior fellow in the UCLA School of Public Affairs since 2007, and she earned her MA there in urban planning in 1989. So it's my great pleasure to present this wonderful panel. We'll start with Lenny. Take it away.
Great. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be working with Sheila again. I've worked with her for many years, and she's just fabulous. You know, the language that we choose to talk about Prop 13 is very important. So even in this slide, someone suggested to me that we need to talk not about reforming, because people get very nervous about that, not about changing, but modifying. So I thought that was useful. And one of the things I try to learn as we talk and present and discuss is really what is the language we need to use to address these issues. How can people understand them? I'm highly immersed in all of it, and you know, sometimes it's, you know, you get too wonky or you get too, you know, talking internally. There really is a need for a discussion of language. So here are the two things that strategically on Prop 13 we think we can address within the near term. One is local vote requirements. The other is the question, the big question of commercial property tax assessments. There are some strategies for change, and we're looking down the line, not necessarily immediately. And one of the questions is, how do you sustain and how do you build as you create these strategies for change? What is it going to take to make the changes we need? Okay, vote requirements in Prop 13. We'll start off with people may know this, 2/3 vote of the legislature for any new revenues. This has been a huge problem in terms of addressing our fiscal crises. We tried to address it in Prop 56 in 2004, went down big time, not likely to be revisited soon. The talk now is that we have supermajorities for Democrats who may or may not vote for taxes. So the question is the local. 2/3 vote for local taxes. We just had a measure in Los Angeles, a transportation measure that got 66.1%. There was one in Alameda that got 66.5%, as opposed to 66.7%. What it basically says is that you need two yes votes on a tax, which is a hard vote to begin with, 2 yes votes on a tax for every no vote. Now, as we say, it's hard to vote for taxes, and then you got 2 to 1 all the way through. So the court actually, special and general taxes, I won't get too wonky here, but actually Prop 13 was very vague on the subject. The courts interpreted the language of Prop 13 to mean a special tax was something that was dedicated revenue like transportation or schools, which is huge, and that needed 2/3. And general is just a majority vote tax. We don't even know whether that was what Howard Jarvis thought, but that's what we have. School bonds, we have passed the reduction in school bonds to 55%. That's made a big difference. For many, many more school bonds have passed since that was lowered a few years ago on the ballot. There are a variety of legislative proposals to allow a 55% vote for so-called special taxes, schools, transportation. There are many efforts, transportation folks, schools, cities and cities, police and fire. What can we do with these votes? My hope is that all these efforts there are a number of efforts in the legislature now. My hope is that they will be combined, that everybody, as in the Prop 30 strategy this year, where everybody rallied around one tax measure, that people will get together and get that done. It's not going to happen until 2014. There is a bill, a number of bills, but SCA 11 by Hancock just says, all right, leave this framework that we have in Prop 13 in place, special and general taxes. They've been defined by the courts and by subsequent measures. So let us lower the vote requirement to 55%. Now that's still more than a majority, but not the 2 to 1 requirement. And on that 2 to 1 requirement, in my experience, anybody opposes something locally, if you don't have unanimity, you're not going to get it passed, because always 20% of voters are against the tax, and then all you need to fight for is 13% more in order to defeat it. So this may be a significant change in terms of restoring some kind of local control. Everybody says that, everyone agrees that Prop 13 took away a lot of local control from voters. And so we may be looking at the 2014 ballot if the legislature can agree on one approach, that they will put on the ballot a change in local voting requirements. So will the legislature put it on the ballot for 2014? So let's get into the property. So we have voting requirements in Prop 13, and those, the 2/3 at the state level, we're not going to address it. The others we may. What are the property tax provisions? We have a fixed 1% rate, but with some small overrides. So the 55% vote for school bonds, for example, leads you to an override. There are some overrides you can do, but for a small amount. Assessments are no more than 2% a year, and that is the 1% rate and the 2% a year are what give homeowners their great sense of security. Our assessments are not going to go up no matter how housing prices are rising. And by the way, most states have some protection for homeowner increases. And the 1% rate means that we can't pile on a bunch of local rates and increase your taxes that way. So these two provisions are what give homeowners their sense of security in terms of the property tax. Now, the reassessed increase at 2% except upon a change of ownership. And a change of ownership, you're reassessed at market value when it changes. So houses always happens. Houses are reassessed when the deed changes. And nobody's going to give you a loan unless the deed changes. So virtually all housing transactions, people tell me about people forming limited liability corporations to hold their houses and get around change of ownership, but that's pretty small. Most of the time you sell your house, you sell your house, the bank gives you a loan, the deed is recorded, and your assessment goes to market value. So somebody catches up at some point, unless you hand it to your kids or grandkids. There are a few exceptions, but that's really a small margin. Commercial property does change ownership continually. It's a myth that it doesn't change ownership. People say, oh, commercial property doesn't change very often. It changes all the time, but it is hugely complex and virtually impossible and easy to avoid any definitions of change of ownership for commercial property. We have LLCs and I'll show some examples of that as we move along, but there are LLCs and trusts and publicly traded corporations, very complicated ways of holding commercial property, which really don't have that much to do with the property tax. They have to do with liquidity and business decisions, partnerships. Partners come and go, but it's very difficult to determine when a change of ownership has actually occurred. The law is terrible. There are been efforts, and one right now in the legislature to fix the law, but those are in some ways tinkering around the margins of a problem that is much more significant. So the results between homeowners and commercial, I'm going to show a few charts. And this is the one that really set me off, the first one here. This is Santa Clara County. The green is the percentage of the role held by by residential, not just single family, but residential, and the other is commercial, the brown. Now think about what's happened in Santa Clara County since property was 50-50 in 1975. We've had a world-class explosion of the largest companies in the world. Apple didn't exist back then, or barely. Google, Fiscal, Intel started up but has grown. Fabulous explosion of commercial development that the world has never seen that kind of wealth. These companies are valued at billions and billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. And yet, all through this period, the share of the property tax held by paid by commercial property versus residential has declined significantly. So Los Angeles, same numbers, started around 50-50, we're now at about 70-30. I brought some local ones. Orange County, the commercial has dropped virtually to nothing. Has there been any commercial growth in Orange County since 1975? And just as there has been in Santa Clara. And here's Ventura. San Francisco, which has not even grown in population, so has still seen a substantial increasing share to the residential versus commercial. Huge commercial development, very little new residential development, same results. 55 out of 58 counties. So, focusing on the commercial property tax, what's going on with it? The problem is that the assessment system fails on many, many levels. We're the only state in the country to use this system. Everybody else assesses at some percentage of market value. It looks at market value. No one would even contemplate using change of ownership for this very, very complicated holding, whether it's publicly traded corporations or LLCs or partnerships or whatever. And the consequences is that I think now, whether it's now or by 2014 or 16, we're looking at a $10 to $12 billion loss in local revenues. Now, local, that is. This is our cities, our counties, and our schools. This is not the state budget, although it would certainly relieve the state budget if we had this money. Okay, so the system fails at virtually every level, and I urge anyone here to challenge this because I love the debate, because I've never found anybody, you can argue about solutions, but I've never found anybody who can defend the current system, which is the economics turns good economics on its head. We tax new investment heavily, and we don't tax land value as it increases, which is the growth of the benefits to society. Land values reflect Santa Clara County is now a whole lot more valuable than it was in 1975 because of the huge amount of benefit that you've had there. The law is completely loophole-ridden. It doesn't take a smart lawyer to avoid change of ownership. Just anybody can do it. And I'll give you some examples there. The land use is bad. This is bad for the environment. And I can tell you many stories about how infill development, junkyards and parking lots are held at extremely low levels. We looked at parking lots in downtown LA. They're paying almost nothing on their land. We looked in East Oakland where people want to invest and the holders of junkyards are not selling the property, holding it off the market for infill development because they don't have to pay any carrying costs on it. There's really no tax in effect. And as fiscal policy, it's bad for infrastructure. As we said, shifts the burden, fails to capture the revenues from growth. So we all want growth. We all need wealth creation. Growth is a positive, and yet we don't. The public sector doesn't grab any revenues from it. And so this is one that's the key, and I urge you to help out with this because I've talked to many business people, and they get it. But sort of as groups, as political entities, the business guys, they just hate even having this discussion. And so what we have is a heavy burden on new development and investment. We inflate the cost of land. You can hold land off the market. Inflated cost of land is probably the worst negative for growth. You want people to invest in equipment and buildings and people and labor. Instead, it gets tied up in an inflated cost of land. Anybody new is taxed at full market value anyway compared to their competitors. We tax all their equipment, that is business, what's called business personal property. Restaurant owner comes in, puts in all their equipment, they're taxed at full market value, plus the sales tax on all that equipment. And we see new development, anyway, it doesn't matter which local government you're talking about. Basically, any new development has got to get hit for fees, exactions, mitigations, easements, everything that you can find, because that's when you have some political control, you can make them pay, and I've talked to a lot of developers about this. I think the negative regulatory climate is not CEQA and our environmental protection. It really is that we don't get the benefits from growth and that we hammer any new developer as hard as we can. And I've said that to the State Chamber of Commerce, and they don't disagree with it, but they certainly don't like the solutions we're talking about. And you're not paying for infrastructure. When you talk to business folks, they say, we need education and we need infrastructure in California. And yet, we would have a virtuous cycle. What is infrastructure except investment in land value? You invest in land, you increase the carrying capacity of the land, you get money back. You know, and then we invest more in infrastructure, what should be a virtuous cycle of infrastructure investment, new revenues coming back, more infrastructure, completely cut off. And the Bay Area Council understood this in the late 80s and talked about reassessing commercial property to deal with the infrastructure issue. So there is a basis, I think, with the discussion with business, even though this is business property, that we can improve the economic climate, the investment climate, the regulatory climate in California with some change in this measure. All right, so here's some examples. Google is paying $58,000 an acre on their new land, but they lease some land from a guy who's held it since 1975. So the land value itself is $400. So on their own land in Mountain View, across this whole range, along northern Santa Clara County. Yahoo is right next to Intel, who's had this land since 1975. Right up the street is Yahoo. They're paying $1 a square foot, $45,000 an acre. Intel is paying 2 cents a square foot on the same land. It's land. We're not talking about the buildings here. A lot of examples. I think my time is running a little short, says Sheila. So there are all kinds of ways I can go on forever of these examples that you find where the way loopholes have been played out. I'll give you one. Martini sold its entire winery, lock, stock, and oak barrels to Gallo. And 20 Martini partners sold to 20 Gallo partners. So they changed the name, it changed the owners entirely, but by the law, there's no change of ownership. That might be fixable in the legislature, but the whole system is not fixable in the legislature, unfortunately. Properties are constantly being transferred without reassessment. So now I get to some simple solutions. Periodically reassess non-residential property at market value. Now, assessors will tell you we can't do this all at once. So, the land values they can do right away. And those are where the greatest disparity is. The building values, people invest in their buildings, they get reassessed. So the building disparities are not that great. Intel is paying a lot, reasonable amount on their buildings, but they're paying nothing on their 62 valuable acres in the heart of Silicon Valley. So it's very doable, and when you start talking about land, everybody goes, well, God, you're really right about that, even to some of the people who would be opposing this. Business personal property tax, I think, is a stupid tax, and that would give you relief for small business. Every restaurant owner that's paying every year on a 30-year depreciation, they're paying 1% a year. They're ending up paying, 10, 12, 15% more on all the equipment they use. So to the extent... and again, you can assess much of this value is in properties that are 20 years old and more. You can bring up the Intel land before you start looking at Yahoo, which has probably been pretty close to market value. So there are many ways of doing this that are actually pretty simple. Results billions of dollars, depending on what trade-offs and how you do it, to cities, counties, and schools, which is another thing that makes this very attractive. People think Sacramento's a black hole. I can tell you, we've been there. I wouldn't say that, but that's what people think. But they do care about their cities, their counties, and their school districts. You get infrastructure. I use this phrase, redevelopment for all, because what is redevelopment in its best form, which is now, Jerry Brown eliminated it, and rightfully so, but what it is in its best form, it's capturing rising land values to pay for infrastructure and improvements. Well, that's what we don't have. That's why we had so much redevelopment. This means we will have a rational system for everybody, not just these redevelopment areas. Land values lowered, land use improved, a better regulatory environment, personal property tax relief for small business, a simpler tax system. Now, people use the phrase split roll. That's what everybody always hears. But actually, it's a smart roll, because the roll is already split in a variety of ways. And split roll is the sort of button that business pushes. I hate split roll. And I say, well, what about the land? Well, that's half a split roll. They have to use that language. And actually, when I use the phrase smart roll, somebody said, yes, smart roll for smart growth. So there's yet another addition to that. Now, the opposition arguments is that we're going to lose jobs, And in fact, the study they did took all the money that you raised and used it to retire bonds, so it was like taken out of circulation. Yeah, take $10 billion out of circulation in California, we're going to lose some jobs, kind of like the sequester that we're talking about right now. Rising prices, do we think that the underlying property tax matters whether what your consumer prices are? We can prove with empirical research that it doesn't, that it's not. You can go to two different places with two different property taxes and buy the same price for your quart of milk. The property taxes are not part of your prices. Commercial rents for some small businesses, there might be an issue there, although mostly not, because rents are at market as well. We've looked at a lot of buildings where they're offering, you know, that are way under assessed. The Irvine Company had a bunch of buildings from the 1980s in Silicon Valley, and the rents that they're offering to the new high-tech folks are market rents. Big surprise. And then the assessors, you start with the oldest first, or you do the land. So those are all, so there are a number of strategic considerations. You know, when you're talking about landowners can raise a huge amount of money. People have raised the specter of Prop 13. You know, is my house going to be challenged? What's going to happen? And no, actually, we're going to improve your community. It's not going to affect residential versus non-residential. And you know, the question of business impacts is one we have to raise, and it's a hard sell to say, hey, we're taxing, well, actually, business property, we're actually taxing land, in effect, which is a good tax, which virtually all economists will tell you is a good tax. What are those business impacts going to be? Well, that certainly is one we're going to have to address as we address this. All right, so how do we get there? The polling has been consistent about 58-34 or 60-34. The last number we saw, Republicans, when asked, should we tax commercial property should we tax it at market value? Republicans were 47-48 in the state of California. So there's a lot to work with potentially there. Building blocks, we really are going to do a lot of research. Other folks will talk about that. Jennifer's working on research. You know, I think if we really show what this means in every community is the goal. That's why it's long term. To research, to show what it means in every take it local, make it real, let people see. If you like the results of what you see, then you're not going to be supportive. If you think what's going on, where properties are being ridiculously assessed, then one next to another, anti-competitive, then if you can see that, then people hopefully will understand it. We need a lot of outreach, organizing, yada, yada, yada. But I think I mean, that's just what we got to do. We do want to force the issue. The goal of what we're trying to do now is that by the beginning of the 2015 legislative session, that this issue, with the research and organizing that we hope to do, will be front and center in front of the legislature. That doesn't mean we're going to get through and win, but it means that tax reform in California will have to include this issue. I've often called it, the way it has worked for years, it's the empire's new clothes. We hide our eyes from this huge hole in the middle of the tax system. So from my perspective, just having the discussion, which is, I'm really happy that people are here, just to have the discussion is to lead to a discussion for some real reform. Thank you.
In the spirit, I'm from USC. I'm with a project manager with the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity. We're in midterms, and so in that spirit, I have a mid-panel pop quiz. And I swear I did not collude with Lenny on this, but if you were listening, you may know. So according to a recent Public Policy Institute of California survey that was done right after the elections in November 2012, what % of adults say Prop 13 has been mostly good for the state? 60% or 31%? Let me call on somebody. What do you think? 60%. That's right, if you're listening to Lenny. 60% of all adults, 31% are actually very good. When asked what Proposition 13's effect has been on local government services, whether it's been good, Raise your hand if you think 61%. Raise your hand if you think 29%. Right. That's right, 29%. So there's a little more, even though that the majority still consistently polls well for Prop 13, when you actually see what it looks like, people know kind of on the ground, there's much more mixed opinions about the effect and how good it's been for us. What percent of adults say that they favor taxing commercial property at market value? 57%, raise your hand. 47%, raise your hand. That's right, you guys are great. That's actually 57%. And 47%, I think as Lenny mentioned, it's actually Republicans actually favor split roll. And so when asked about different state proposals for tax reform, actually this is one of the ones that polls the best versus if you were to reinstate the vehicle license fee or extend the sales tax to services. This is the one area where there seems to be some softening of public opinion. And this is why we're really excited to be having this conversation. I mean, I know Lenny's been doing this for 25 years. I mean, it's not a new conversation, but I do feel like it's a new moment and a new opening. So we're really excited. We're here kind of on the ground floor, and we want to invite the conversation today as we're trying to shape this long-term with a research project that I'll talk about in a little bit. Oops. So first, reforming Prop 13, what's needed. You know, we tend to react to the next crisis. We tend to think about short-term pressures and politics. We tend to think from election cycle to election cycle. You know, it's what's really needed is time to take a step back and take a longer view. I mean, Prop 30 has not saved the world at all, but it's given us just a little, between Prop 30 and Prop 39, we have a little bit of breathing room that we actually have some time to look at, take a longer view, both in terms of where we're going as a state, but actually really dig in and do the research, the organizing, the conversations to really put our collective brains together to think about what's really needed for Prop 13. And it's also time to engage in a new civic and civil conversation. And that's what we're excited to be here tonight to do. And thirdly, committed to data-driven decision-making. As a researcher, that's my where I stand. So the future, we have to think about the future as being here now. California is changing. We are currently 6 and 10, you know, California is ahead of the, a phrase that my boss, Manuel Pastoral, often says is that California and Los Angeles is America and fast forward. We've crossed the majority-minority threshold back in 2000. That's where the rest of the country is going. Right now, 6 in 10 Californians are people of color. By 2050, 3/4 of Californians will be people of color. And you know what? We're still African Americans, Latinos, a lot of Asian ethnicities are failing in educational outcomes, skill level outcomes, income levels, in almost every metric, as well as in political and social equity as well. So we need to be prepared by taking on these social and economic inequalities now. And that economic equity is not a luxury. There's more research, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in more detail, but what the research is finding is that more equitable regions in general generate more economic growth. So it's not that we just want to be good, it's not just that we want to fight for economic justice from a morality standpoint, but it actually makes good economic sense as well. And reform proposals have to be evaluated with regard to equity, the economy, and changing demographics. And so one of the things that from our perspective can be regional is that we also want to make sure that we're minimizing disparities between populations, within regions, and between regions, within California, which is a very complex state, as you all know. First, before looking forward, I actually want to just take a step back. Back in January 2008, Governor Schwarzenegger declares fiscal state of emergency. I think within an 18-month period, there were 3 fiscal state of emergencies. In January, there was a $14.5 billion deficit. And if you all remember that as soon as a budget deal was made, it would be out of date. The economy was starting to tank. That by February 2009, we had faced more than a $40 billion deficit over the combined 2008-2009 2009-2010 budget years. By fall of 2008, that's when the housing market unravels, the financial system collapses, we're full down, the economic downturn hits the state, furthering, limiting the revenues. So in October 2008, the legislative leadership and the governor established the Commission on the 21st Century Economy, which was just a fancy word of saying tax commission without saying taxes. And so that's where I came on, and just for the record, I was appointed by Assembly Speaker Karen Bass. So the problem, you know, there wasn't a whole lot of disagreement, or there is not a whole lot of disagreement about what the problem is. But the charge was to look at the outdated tax structure. We're working with a tax structure that's been in place since 1930, when we were primarily in agriculture, manufacturing sector, and that's not to say that those aren't still important industries here. But since then, we've shifted much more to a service-based, information-based. Back then, we were buying goods. Now we're buying a lot more services. It's a lot of information-driven. So that was one of the charges, was to figuring out what's happened over time is that what we are taxing is becoming more and more narrow, and so the rates have gone up. So kind of the mantra has always been we want to broaden the base but lower rates, and part of that is because we're out of sync with where we are as the economy. Also, what has shifted, and part of this is because of, as part of what we've done with our property taxes and Prop 13, is that we're dealing with much more volatile revenue streams. And so when you see at the red graphs here, that's the change in revenue from year to year. The green is the total major revenues from income tax, sales tax, corporate tax. And when you look at the blue line, that's California personal income. That's basically a measure of just kind of where we are with the economy. So we've been way out of sync with the economy, and it's made us uncompetitive. So the goals of the commission were to establish a 21st century tax structure to align it with the economy. Part of the goal was also to stabilize state revenues, so we weren't dealing with these peaks and valleys. Thirdly, to promote long-term economic prosperity, improve our ability to compete, reflect principles of sound tax policy, which are around that simple, fair, equitable, transparent, and again, to ensure the tax structure is fair and equitable. The outcomes, I won't drag you through the whole ruling process, but there are about 9 meetings. Originally, the idea was that we're going to put some vote. It was a 14-member commission. We were going to bring all the best experts. We figured there was some solution out there. The whole premise was that we wanted that the lawmakers were dealing with the crisis, that they needed a group to kind of step back from that, not deal with the immediate crisis, but take a longer view to think about what are some overarching structural issues that we could address. During the course of the commission, we were supposed to be done in 6 months. The idea was not to have this drawn out. The idea was to have 6 months, and if there was consensus coming out of the recommendations, that the idea was that the legislature would give it a thumb up or thumb down, since nobody could agree on the specifics. The idea was that it would go as a whole comprehensive package. So in the end, the proposed structure was to reduce the personal income tax, make it much flatter, so raising more at the bottom end, lowering it at the top end, completely eliminate the corporate tax, eliminate the general use sales tax, and kind of where all that revenue was going to, all that lost revenue was going to come from was this idea of a new business net receipts tax, which has never been tested. But the idea, it was kind of it was a backdoor way of trying to figure out how to tax more services. So the whole idea was that you would take all of the receipts that a business makes, you would subtract any payments that you make to other companies, and that difference is what you would pay a tax on. That was the idea. Also to initiate a rainy day reserve fund, and then institute tax appeals dispute resolution process. The overall effect of this package was that the average millionaire would save about $109,000 a year, whereas the people making between $20,000 and $50,000 would benefit by a $4 more in their pocket. So, needless to say, I was one of the dissenting members. There was actually went ahead and did it. We didn't really know what consensus was going to be, but there were 5 of us who declined from all across the political spectrum for various reasons. So that got countered by a blue proposal, which added in the package supermajority requirements, pollution tax, to back away from the actual implementation of the business net receipts tax, but actually to study it, to extend the sales tax to services, split roll, oil severance. So needless to say, that prompted the red, white, and blue plan. So, I mean, the point of this, and we can talk more about this in the discussion if folks want, but the main point of that was that there was no consensus, there was disagreement. I mean, this is going to continue. This is very difficult, complex issues. But one of my key takeaways from that was that there was a real missed opportunity here. We had, actually, some folks came to talk about the property tax, but it was mysteriously missing from any further discussion and from anywhere in the package when it actually met most of the goals and the principles. So my key takeaways from this is that it requires tough decisions. Given the complexity, and I'm not a tax structure expert at all, but it's complex. There's conflicting goals. I mean, I think we can agree on some goals, but you have to make tough choices. There are tensions and trade-offs. So where we need to start is identifying some subset of commonly held principles. One of the things that that was something that we didn't do at the Tax Commission, was actually agree to what the goals were or to prioritize the goals when we knew that they were going to come in conflict. It was only at the very, very end when we were able to get some kind of semblance or some kind of agreement that progressivity in the tax structure was something that we somewhat wanted to preserve. But again, being clear, and the other thing that was never explicitly agreed to, and it wasn't anywhere in writing, but was kind of forced through, was that the whole package needed to be revenue neutral, rather than growing the pie. So, anyways, I think my key takeaway from that was that it's really important to start with a commonly held set of principles, and that equity needs to be more prominent in the conversation. I mean, I was coming from a position from the nonprofit organization that I was working with at the time, and there's not, given the constituencies that we were working with, there's not a lot of resources, there's not a lot of folks at these tables that are there to lift up the equity, the importance of equity. So why does equity matter? Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just something that we want to do, that we should feel good about, but it's actually good for economic growth. What we're doing here is partnering with PolicyLink. We've been doing a lot of work. On our side up here, we've been doing a lot of the analytics, the quantitative analysis to actually demonstrate that equity is linked to growth. That actually, at least there's evidence showing that at the metropolitan regions, that when you have a strong middle class, when you have a lot of minority business owners, that when smaller gaps in racial gaps in education outcomes, actually the region does a lot better. That's evidence that's also been shown through a study from the Federal Reserve as well. So, and also there's beginning to be evidence that it's actually also linked to longer growth, economic growth spells as well. And so we need a new paradigm, and I say this both to those of us that care about equity, that advocates can't only think about equity, but also need to think about economics and economic prosperity and growth, and not think about just the taxes or the tax system as a redistributive mechanism, but we actually have to think about how can we use this to grow the pie. And I also challenge business leaders and economic development folks to lift up equity as well. So we we need a new paradigm moving forward for the good of us all. So back to commercial property tax reform, which is why you're all here. So what we're doing is that we've just started, we're on the ground floor, but what we want to do is to build off of the great work that Lenny has done and to identify and analyze and explain some broad trends at the county and at the state level. What you see there at the map is kind of is showing the darker the county, the greater share of the total property tax rolls is borne by residential properties. So we want to look at this a little deeper. We want to look at this just even within counties. We're suspecting there's a strong geographic dimension to this. So our starting point right now is that we want to analyze trends in 3 to 4 counties, just because we want to see, is there enough precedence out there for us to really kind of see differences between regions, within regions. We're starting, Lenny knows this probably better than we do, and he's been advising us on this, but there's a lot of variation within the information that counties track and what's available. And they're proprietary real estate databases as well that have some information but not everything. So we want to kind of, where we're at right now is really trying to figure out a methodology that we want to be able to, that we can apply to all counties, regardless of how much information we're able to get from the county. Again, learning lessons from the tax commission. Our starting framework is that we want a tax system that's going to support growth and competitiveness, that's non-deficit inducing as well as equitable. And when we talk about equitable, we think about it in 2 ways. There's vertical equity, which is that owners of highly valuable properties would pay more in taxes than owners of less valuable property. And we also want to think about equity and horizontal equity, that owners of 2 similar properties should pay a similar amount in property taxes. So we're building on a lot of great work that's been going on, looking at disparity ratios, so looking at the value of sold properties versus that last assessed value. And looking at this at the county level and the city level. We're going to see if we can look at this even at a finer grain at the neighborhood level. The work that's been done has also been looking primarily at the property's total value. So again, we want to see if if we can break that apart and look at what's going on with the land versus with the property improvements, which are the buildings. And we are going to, kind of the other critical piece is looking at the base year, the final year that the property was last reassessed. And there's documentation of horizontal inequities and all that as well. So that's what we're building off of. Our preliminary set of research questions, and this is just kind of, again, we're planning out a 6-month horizon at this point. Our goal is to eventually do a full research project that will look at this for each county, or a good handful of counties within California. But what we want to look at are the disparities in land and building values and base years by county, compare counties, compare that actually over time. Trying to understand what's the proportion of underassessed versus market value land within counties and how wide are these gaps, and estimate how much revenue would be raised by bringing the land value up to market value. Understand and explore kind of the shift from commercial to residential share, and to see to what extent can that really be pegged to the lag in assessment in commercial property. And also see if there's a relationship between assessed values and intensity of land use. So in places like South LA, there's a lot of vacant land. So we want to see if there's some kind of relationship there that can inform policy solutions. And then look at the relationship between assessment and type of ownership, LLC, all of those types. And then also see if there's any kind of relationship between rental values and property taxes as well. That's just our beginning set. And what I open our conversation to up later is what else should we be asking? Thank you.
As Sheila said, for those who might have come in late, my name is Michele Pritchard, and I am representing the Liberty Hill Foundation, which for 37 years has been making grants to grassroots organizations working to advance equality and social justice in Los Angeles. And part of my work at Liberty Hill has involved serving as a senior advisor to California Calls, since many of our longtime grantees are members of that network. Now, Sheila asked me, you know how it is when Sheila asks you something. Sheila says, Michele, I would really like it if you would talk about the organizing work. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. And that aspect of how we begin this new dialogue on Prop 13. In other words, you know, how do we begin to build public awareness and public support to look at the disparities that Lenny talked about and Jennifer, to look at the consequences of the current tax system and the potential for billions of dollars in new revenues. California Calls, which has worked on several tax and budget issues over the last several years, including most recently Prop 30 last November, is beginning to move in this direction of exploring the possibilities for commercial property tax reform. And for those of you who have not heard of California Calls before, which is probably most of you here, it is a statewide alliance of community-based organizations that has formed really for the purpose of reclaiming the California dream by working for greater equity and fairness in tax and fiscal policy so that we can have stable and adequate public services, high road economic growth, and a government that's responsive to community needs. So Jennifer referred to this. What, you know, really, I wanted to begin by just providing some context and what were the conditions that gave rise to California Calls in 2007. So Jennifer already really covered this. Basically, the state has been in a deficit situation. Many of you here are community leaders, elected leaders, so you know this only too well. But beginning in 2002, and here is a quotation from a report, Back on Track by the California Budget Project, that we have sustained billions of dollars in budget cuts, $20 billion in 1 year alone between 2007 and 2008, with tremendous impacts in low-income, working class, and middle class communities around the state. I wanted to talk just for a second, go through some slides quickly about what those billions of dollars in cutbacks have meant to school children, to college students, and to low-income families. Sheila likes lots of factoids, so we've got them in this presentation between all of us here. This next set of slides is from the California Budget Project, which is a wonderful nonpartisan research institute. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them, and I encourage you to check out their website. So, question for everybody: how many here have a child who is still in K-12 education and public education? Okay, good number of them. And I see Sherry Davis and Denny Zane here, hi, who of course have been leaders in the movement to keep public education well funded. Here what we see is the trend in per student spending for K-12, which was roughly $9,100 in 2007, plunging after that to a low of $7,300, almost $2,000 less in 2011. And now we're beginning to climb our way back out of the hole with Proposition 30, but the current budget projects roughly an $8,300 per student spending level for next year, still about $850 below what we had in 2007. This is another look at the same problem. Just look at the trend line here. It's hard to see the detail. But we see that California's per student spending has declined over the last 40 years since 1970 as compared to the rest of the country. Each bar here shows the difference between California's per student spending when compared with that of all other states averaged together, with the exception of District of Columbia. So by 2010 and 11, here we are. We're spending actually $3,000 less per student than the U.S. average, placing California in 46th place out of 50 in K-12 student spending. Again, any parent in the room knows this, any teacher in the room, and certainly our school board leadership. Here's moving on to higher education. Question, anybody here with a child or in the Cal State system? I'm actually one of them. Okay, see another one over here. Or anybody who is in it, I see some young people here who might actually be, or even older people who might be students at Cal State. Well, you know the story here as well. We see the history of general fund support between 2007 and 2011. A full $1 billion was lost from the Cal State system, a full 1/3, lost from general fund support. And even with the new funds coming in now from Prop 30, general fund spending is going to be creeping up to about $2.3 billion, but is still significantly below, about 20% below where it was just 7 years ago. And what has that meant for students? Here are the UC and CSU student fees. I'm sorry I don't have community college. I didn't have a lot of time to prepare this, but I'm sure we would see the same trend. We have big increases in fees over the last 10 years, beginning with the chronic budget deficit, started in 2002. But note the really sharp increase that begins to take off in 2007, just as Jennifer discussed a moment ago. Back then, UC tuition was roughly $7,000 compared to about $12,000, a little over $12,000 now. CSU tuition around $3,000, now escalating to $5,500. So what has it done? Of course, it has, it has pushed out many low-income, working-class families and kids out of the public higher education system. And as we know all too well, in addition to the increased tuition, there have been severe reductions in class availability, so that many students are stuck in school for 5 years and even more to graduate with their required courses. Leaving education, of course, the state spends a lot of money on health and welfare. And CalWORKs, as you know, is an income support program for poor women and their families while they are looking for jobs or undergoing job training. And remember that about 4 out of 5 recipients of CalWORKs dollars are in fact kids. And this program has provided an ever-dwindling amount of support for those families and kids. And this graph here simply shows that the proposed max grant for the coming year, of a little over $600 for a family of 3, has only about half the purchasing power compared to the grant had it kept pace with inflation. So that's what that spread is. In other words, poor families have become much poorer over these last 2 decades. Won't go into detail here. Where does California fall with regard to the rest of the country for needy family support? We're pretty much in the middle. That's that dark bar there. With CalWORKs grants covering only about 47%, almost half the cost of average rental housing. And as we know, families have a lot more expense each month besides just their rent. And here's the last one of these slides here. Talking about childcare slots, I see Judy Abdo here, who's worked in this field for her whole life almost in her long job. Yeah. Showing the decline in state-subsidized childcare and preschool programs, programs that enable young mothers or mothers with young children to be able to go to work and which have very strong results for child welfare and well-being. And here you can see that we've lost over 100,000 of those subsidized slots since 2007, or about 20% of the program overall. So, just as a conclusion to this section, these are the conditions which have, these deep budget cuts over this period that have led to the formation of California Calls. So, what is it? Here we go. California Calls is a statewide alliance of 31 community-based organizations in 12 counties across the state. And the purpose of this affiliation and this alliance is really to reclaim the California dream of outstanding public education, public infrastructure, and public services. Now, the groups that are members are community-based groups using community organizing to address issues of social equity, especially amongst those who are the most vulnerable and who have the least amount of voice in public policy. And there are many, many veteran community organizers in this room, so I don't probably even need to say this, but Sheila did want me to be clear that community organizing really involves developing trained outreach workers who go door to door, have one-on-one conversations over the phone, in meetings, and work with residents to hear their concerns, and out of that develop strategies for making concrete changes in public policy. They also work to train neighborhood residents and other constituents to become leaders themselves. So these groups are spread throughout the state, both in urban areas, designated there by the blue. The pink represent more rural, suburban, and shifting areas. And these are groups that are working on a wide variety of social change issues, including educational equity, affordable housing, low-wage work, the safety net, and so on. Here in Los Angeles, one of the groups is the Community Coalition for Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment, of which Steve Tarzinski in our front row here has been one of the founding board members, so Steve is probably well acquainted with this work. But the purpose of California Calls, again, coming back to our theme for tonight, is really to work for greater tax equity and fairness, and to do it through ever greater voter engagement across the state, especially amongst unlikely voters. So our primary focus is working to change the electorate to help it look more like the population of California. Jennifer mentioned this because the people who are most hurt by the budget cuts we've just taken a look at are the poor. They are children, they are predominantly people of color, they are the young, and they tend to vote at much lower rates compared to their proportion in the population. Now this slide, which is a little bit old, shows that, for example, in 2006, Latinos, who were 38% of the population, were only 17% of the electorate, and you can see the others there. Just in general, likely voters, as you probably know, tend to be more white, more upper income, and older than the California population as a whole. Oops. So, what's the strategy of California Calls for changing the electorate to look more like the population? You know, it's a big state, and a community organizing effort that's really rooted in one-on-one contact simply can't have the reach of paid TV advertising or paid mailers, and instead it's a different strategy of trying to really mobilize a tipping point of voters, really a very small percent. So let me just try to explain this very quickly. You know, many ballot measures, ballot initiatives in California are actually decided in the end by a very small percentage of voters, typically somewhere between 3 and 5%. So that's the point of this graph here. Actually, remember just last June there was a cigarette tax measure that was on the ballot to raise money for cancer research. It failed by 49.8%. Which was really just a little bit over 20,000 votes in this huge state that it lost by. A ton of money was spent by the tobacco companies, of course. But the point again is that it's a very small number of votes that frequently determine the outcome. This slide shows that of the 23 million people registered to, or excuse me, 23 million, yes, that were registered to vote, eligible, excuse me, thank you, eligible. We thought that about 77%, or about 13 million of them, would actually turn out to vote, and in fact we were pretty close. This was heading into November. The actual turnout was about 12.6 million voters. And so our goal, you know, knowing that people, as they go down the ballot, they start to drop off and they don't get to the last measures and they don't get to the judges and so forth, right? But our goal was to really try to secure about 250,000 votes in favor of Proposition 30, which would be equal to about 4%, right in the middle of that 3 to 5% range. Let me go to this next one here. So, how did we do it? Huh, this is so interesting. It picked up this slide. Okay, it's all right. We can work with it here. So over the last 3 years, California Calls, through 9 different civic engagement programs where people go door to door, call on the phones, not robocalls, but real live people phoning, has actually reached out and talked to over 700,000 voters through that form of community organizing, both with volunteers and with paid staff members. We talk about the problems that are facing the state and identify people who support the notion of reclaiming the California dream through fair taxation, and then we try to follow up with people all the way to the polls. We have trained groups on a very sophisticated predictive dialing system, and we really geared it up in the November election. And we found that the messenger really matters, and this is just a really key point. Voters are willing to trust their peers, be they parent to parent, young person to young person, or in the case of California Calls, having bilingual organizers who have been able to talk to voters in Spanish or in Chinese if that happens to be their native language. All right, so what were the results of our work in the most recent election? You'll remember that Prop 30 won with a little over 55% of the vote, or 7 million votes. That's the green shaded area on the ring up there. The red is the no vote, around 44%. And the important point here is that the statewide voter turnout on average was 71%, whereas the California Calls supporters, people we identified being in support of Prop 30, turned out at a significantly higher rate of actually 80%, so a 9%, 9% difference. And the ring at the top shows that, you know, when you look at the number that we turned out for November, plus all the people we've talked to over the many, actually over 3 years now, we did in fact help to contribute between 3 and 6% of the total vote that helped to pass Prop 30. So that's the point of this. Without that field effort, I think it's unlikely it would have won. Let me go, I'm going to shorten up here a little bit. And really quickly, we've taken a look at some of the historically underrepresented or unlikely voters and what was our impact. The top graph, not top, but here you see young voter turnout. And so, for example, in the 18 to 24 age group, 63% of our supporters turned out compared to the statewide average of 54. Then that next age group of 25 to 34, we actually had a 72% turnout. You know, we're able to go back and pull the voter rolls and actually match it up with the people who had said yes. Next slide. Similarly, for unlikely voters by race, California Calls produced a very high turnout. African Americans voted, that we contacted and had their support, actually voted at an 85% rate compared to 67%. And so forth. And this is a little harder to decipher. I think it lost the title. No, it didn't. Okay, I don't, but this is weird. It just picks up a little different. Okay. That's what's throwing me off. This is immigrant voter turnout, where we also did exceptionally well, showing that our immigrant citizens voted at a rate of 81% compared to the statewide average of only 68%, so a big 13-point spread there. And in some counties, like Ventura, we had a spread of 16%, in Kern County 13%, so that's what those little bubbles are showing there. And again, we attribute this to that one-to-one voter contact, which really makes a difference with new and occasional voters, as well as the language translation. So what does all this mean for our subject tonight of the California state budget situation going forward and potential Prop 13 reform? So just wanted to make a couple of points in closing. First, Prop 30 was an important victory, but insufficient. It only replaces about $6 billion of that $20 billion that was lost just in that 1 year period. And it's our position, and I'm sure many of the folks in this room, that we really need a lot more revenue to try to restore California to greatness. Second, we think it's important to look at a variety of revenue measures, corporate tax loopholes, oil severance tax, cigarette taxes, but we think the commercial property tax system seems the most promising for reform because of the vast inequity that Lenny talked about earlier, and its potential to generate significant funds. Third, we think it's very important to make the discussion local and specific for voters. So we are really looking forward to the research results from USC as well as Lenny's organization so that we can demonstrate specific properties here in Santa Monica that pay different rates, you know, the big hotels, other businesses, and spell out what that would mean for our community. What would that mean in terms of new police officers, new teachers in the classroom, longer hours at the libraries. Fourth, we want to keep voters informed and engaged in the discussion through community organizing. We are likely to get involved in 2014, possibly around some of the legislative proposals that Lenny talked about to lower the threshold for local voting to 55% on parcel taxes and on other significant measures. And finally, we know it's crucial to build a broad base of support amongst a cross-section of voters. So, over the next several months, we're going to be reaching out and trying to take the temperature, thus the thermometer logo here, of a variety of kinds of a variety of groups, everything from environmental organizations to League of Women Voters to the PTA to United Way, business associations, unions, and we want to ask them how much do they know about this issue? Do they understand it? Does it line up with their policy priorities for the coming period? What messages do they think will be most important to move voters? So I would like to invite people here to, you know, if you are a member or a leader of an organization that you think would like to weigh in on this discussion that we'll be having over the next several months. We're actually doing formal interviews. Please see me afterwards. So just in closing, thanks for your attention, and we hope that together we will be able to find a way to restore California to greatness, put it back on track, and reclaim our future as the Golden State. So thanks very much.
So while we're moving our chairs here, and I think, Michael, we can probably turn this off. Oh, that was such good timing. So we're going to go right into the questions and answers, hopefully, and questions and hopefully answers. And while they're moving their chairs, I want to just say that
first, it'd be interesting to see how the inflated land prices have squeezed public services in terms of land for schools, for parks, etc., and what kind of unhealthy financing mechanisms have governments had to go to cover that gap. The second one, which might be too hard to get, is how has it affected the distribution of wealth in the state? That might be too lefty-ish, but it would be interesting. Lenny, my question for you is, when you've been on a panel with somebody like Joel Fox, I mean, you gave us your good answers to their typical questions. What have been the hardest things that he has said back that you've had, or others like him, that you've had to respond to?
Well, it's interesting because...
let Jennifer answer the first question.
Oh, no, yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we know that from Prop 13, it's created all sorts of skewed economic decisions around land use, contributing to sprawl, and that folks have had to really pretzel themselves to find, funds to make it for education. But you were also asking about, in terms of, because there's more of an emphasis and local governments need to raise revenues, that they'll do car dealership, for example, versus the school. Is that the kind of question you're looking at?
Well, or even to pay, I mean, if we want to get land for a new school or for a park or for affordable housing, if the land cost is inflated, one, it's made it harder to fulfill those needs, and then two, what have government agencies done to raise those kind of funds because they've had to pay too much?
There's been a major impact on affordable housing. When you talk to affordable housing developers, the inability to get land. Recently, discussion with the Oakland Planning Department, where there was a bunch of land they were looking at, and the sellers had no incentive to sell except at highly inflated values. So definitely the case. You know, with regard to Joel Fox, he and I have debated probably 100 times, and we've agreed to disagree on. You know, I've said, well, if on the housing side, on the homeowner side, the Prop 13 may be very extreme in its effects in terms of the side-by-side differences and the lock-in effects, but that, in fact, if it hadn't occurred, we would have had to invent a system like other states have to prevent just from rising land values where people's incomes aren't going up, but their neighborhood values are going up, to prevent those kinds of increases. So I kind of acknowledge that, there is the rationale for Prop 13 fits with housing to some extent. That's what it was for. He has had to acknowledge that the loopholes are enormous, that the rationale doesn't exist. And in fact, there was a case that was going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court on commercial property. It was Macy's. And Joel and the Jarvis folks started cutting up their Macy's credit cards. And this was the only time anybody's ever heard of where a case was actually certified to go to the U.S. Supremes. And the plaintiff, Macy's, because they'd come into a shopping center much later than someone else, dropped the case. Then a housing case went, and the Supreme said, well, there's a rational basis on the houses.
200 years ago, the property tax was a progressive tax. Most people, their wealth was in property, and that was taxed. Everybody paid that tax. Now most wealth is in personal property, stocks, etc. Is there any kind of long-term sense anywhere that people are saying, we could really reduce the property tax down to like nothing if we tax all property at a small rate? Does anybody ever get into that? Is that
There has been consideration of that. In fact, the California Constitution, the old section on property tax, does talk about the taxing intangible wealth, stocks and bonds, and other things. I've gotten a lot of questions like that. I believe Vermont has this very small wealth tax. So I'm not, the problem at a state level is that it's very, very, very mobile. That you're, one of the reasons is very hard at the state. We've talked about stock transaction taxes, but intangible wealth is very mobile at a state level in this modern environment.
And on a global level as well.
Yeah.
Turn this and on a global level as well. The other thing I think about wealth tax that's been very interesting to me about people's attitudes is that in America, everyone always thinks they're going to be richer, even now. And so they're somewhat reluctant to punish the next group up because they honestly believe they may attain it. I've seen this a lot.
40% of Americans think they're going to be in the top 1%.
Tori says 40% of all Americans believe they're going to be in the top 1%. But they think the top 1% is about $40,000. But in the legislature, where many of the people do not come from wealth, I'd say 90% of them. Many were the first in their family to go to college. Many of them came from immigrant and poor families. They also believe that opportunity would be stifled if we were to tax wealth more. So there's a barrier there, both with the people and with the legislators.
Maybe I'm asking what you just said, but commercial property owners, when they become cognizant that modifying Prop 13 will be a reality, do you envision a damper put on property improvements?
No, actually, this is where I was trying to say what we have is the exact opposite. Property improvements right now are reassessed. So the current system, when you look at, and we've looked at a lot of hotels, and the Santa Clara Marriott, for example, but Hilton is very much the same. Many hotels are on leased land. So the hotels, in order to compete, they cannot, allow a 1975 hotel to be hanging around. Nobody's coming there. They're not going to the Santa Clara Marriott if it's not upgraded. When it gets upgraded, you take out all your permits, it gets reassessed. Equipment, putting in new equipment, whether it's high-tech or a restaurant putting in stoves and refrigerators and ovens, that's all taxed at full market value. So all of the improvements that we do are already taxed. What's not taxed, and this is the back to the Santa Clara Marriott, they're paying, the original owner of land has 50% of the property. Santa Clara, the Marriott system has the other 50%. It has never changed ownership by law, and they're being taxed at virtually nothing on this huge area of land, and they're being fully taxed on all the improvements they've already put in. So in fact, no economist, I've trained as an economist, and one of the things you say is, well, don't tax new investment, tax what are called economic rents. Well, the biggest economic rent, this gets back historically to Henry George, and the property and land tax is on the value of land. I don't create the land value. Social investment, whether it's other private investment or whether it's the infrastructure that public investment puts in, gets you to a better community and rising land values. That is the ideal thing to tax by any economist standard, not the new investment, and we do exactly the opposite. So it is true that the business community right now, not when you talk individually and meet with people, but as organized politically, it's like they have this notion is anathema to them. It's so anathema that you can't even have the discussion, because to have the discussion is to recognize how bad the system is.
That's one of the things that we want to look at, is that difference between the land and the improvements. A lot of studies have been done looking at both. And I think there's a lot of disparity about how the county assessors assess what they assign to land versus to improvements, but that's one of the things that we want to look at. And we think that we can't really compare between counties because different counties will have different practices, but what we want to try and do is go back and look at how a historical perspective to look at this difference and to see if we can try and bring out what the difference will be in separating out the land versus the improvement.
Tori, has there ever been a campaign to try to change this, or a public awareness campaign, or, I mean, why hasn't anybody done this before?
Well,
It seems like the only state in the country, it seems
in the early 80s, there were some petitions carried. In the late 80s, there were some petitions carried to do this. And I get calls virtually every day. How come we're not going to the ballot? At the same time, the understanding is that you can only really do it until you have really built a very broad base, very broad educated base. And that does mean, as Jennifer was pointing out, really having people understand what's at stake in their communities. So I've talked to property owners who say, well, this is going to hit me, but if it means police and fire and roads and local services, I get that. I can understand that. Or another way we'll look at it is the land under the Beverly Wilshire compared to that old Robinson May across the street, which was recently bought out for a whole lot of money. It's just pure land. The Beverly Wilshire, if it were paying what across Merv Griffin Way is right now, what it was worth, would be paying about $800,000 to $1 million more. Well, $1 million is how many cops on the street, how many teachers in the schools, and that's where when people can both looking at these properties and say, hey, it's right across the street here, what's going on, but also saying, by their not paying their taxes, what is that? How does that and that's the role of the community organizations to say, how does that translate into the lack of services we're getting? So ultimately, when you go to the ballot, we're hoping that as a result of a lot of the research, you're going to know who's going to be paying what, and who's going to get hit by it, and how much, what's it going to mean to every city, county, and school district. And some people, Ford Motor Company bought a whole lot of land in downtown Beverly Hills, which they still have, and it's assessed at virtually nothing. Now they lease it out. There's buildings on it, but so is it going to? Who's going to be paying the difference? And we'll know that. And then you can look at it and say, I'm not voting for that because I don't think that Chevron should be paying more, but I doubt that's the
And another thing, and just to be clear, with my USC hat, we're just playing a research role, so we're just kind of doing the research. We're not involved in endorsing any kind of policy or legislation. So I just wanted to make that clear and on the record.
But just to jump in, we're looking forward to seeing what you find out, and we're making some assumptions that it will support the kinds of arguments that Lenny's been making for 25 years, and that with that very local specific information, groups can take it around to conferences and press events, and it really just uses it as an educational tool. That's what
What she really means is social media, but we're not in that generation.
But I think because it hasn't been taken up as a real conversation or as a real debate, is that it's just surprisingly how little research there is out on that. I mean, I think Lenny is probably, and folks he's been affiliated with, have been the biggest contributors. But because of that, there's just not a lot of research out there, which is extremely surprising given how long we've been living under this situation.
I'd like to play devil's advocate from a commercial property owner standpoint. The argument I've heard made is if the taxes rise, they'll just pass it through to the tenants as a triple net charge or modified gross, and so that charge will, the businesses will suffer because their bottom lines will suffer, and that will get passed through to consumers and higher products charges. That's number one. I wonder how we confront that argument. The second one is, has anyone thought about ramping up a phase-in, let's say, of an increase in the tax, so that people that own property can plan for it better.
Yeah, I think that the second is actually a lot of times when we've really had this discussion at a serious level, it's like, well, can you do it all at once? Can you ramp it up? You know, we're all living with this system. It can take a few years to phase in. It can take longer to phase in. It also very help. You know, the discussion about. In fact, if you said all we got to do is reassess property every 20 years, we would. Most of the huge disparities that we see are pre-1990 properties, or those that were bought and are assessed in terms of the 80s, but that doesn't speak to the ramp-up issue. That is, those are the big ones. On the triple net lease, the chair of my board is actually, people may know him, Roy Ulrich, is a commercial property owner in the Los Angeles area. And it's not always the case, or it's often not the case that you have triple net leases that say property taxes are going up, but in the longer term, what people are charging is the market. So you look at a really under-assessed property. The landlord's not saying, I'm not charging market rate. I got a vacancy here. I'm charging market rate. The market goes down, market goes up. And in fact, if the commercial property market goes down, as it did in downtown Los Angeles in the 90s, early 90s, property values decline. That's one of the virtues of the system. So do they pass that on in rents? Well, probably, because the rent, empty buildings, the rents go down. With regard to prices, both of these are empirical questions. There was a woman who describes herself as a Republican mom in Menlo Park, and she walked the mean streets of Menlo Park. And one of the things she did is she took her laundry or dry cleaning to a dry cleaner where the rents were high, and a dry cleaner where the rents were where the property taxes were closer to market, and where the property taxes were extremely low. Well, big surprise, no difference. Or we've looked at a lot of gas stations. The locally owned gas station is paying, let's say, and this was a circumstance, $30,000 in property tax. The Shell and the Chevron stations, right near the same intersections, were paying $10,000 in property taxes. Do we think that gas prices were different? No, they were determined by the market. So those are the kinds of empirical questions that you can really demonstrate in these cases. And that's because the tax information, this is one of the very few areas of the tax system where all the information is public.
I don't really have a question. I actually just want to thank you all for doing what you're doing for public education. I'm a student here at SMC, and I'm politically active on campus. And I want to tell you that these budget cuts, I can see them on my fellow students. You know, you can see the impacts. They care less and less about things that actually matters. And I just want to say that I really appreciate that you all doing this, and it's really important. And we students that care, we're trying to get meetings monthly on campus, trying to get the students involved and engaged. It's hard, but we're trying to do our part, and I just want to thank you all for doing this for us. Thank you very much.
Well, what we're doing is paying it forward, because a lot of people did it for us. And so just remember, if we can accomplish anything for you, pay it forward. Okay, any first questions first? Yes.
Yeah.
You're it.
Thanks to the panel. I'm a little confused. Maybe Jennifer can give me some focus. Thank you for coming out. You said that in your research, you're trying to find a principle of equity, and you went on to say, I want to grow the pie. Now, maybe I'm skewed here. I sense equity meaning fairness, that everybody in every sector contributes to the better or higher good, that not one sector underwrites or pays for these benefits. The example given on commercial property was excellent. First of all, commercial property is exempt from rent control. It's in the statute. Second of all, there is no empirical data, directly or indirectly, that says on a triple net lease, 99% of these are triple net leases, that they are automatically going to pass them through or not pass them through. You say the market. But my question is, using equity and fairness, and everyone grows the pie, how do people that live in housing, whose rents, if any, are stabilized, how do they pay their fair share of the increase in property taxes when their increase, if any, is stabilized? Thank you.
One of the reasons, very carefully talk about commercial versus residential, but you pointed to, you know, what is the in-between area. Residential is where people live. In the major cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and some of the smaller cities, Santa Monica, West Hollywood, but San Jose, Oakland, all have rent control. And I believe you would make the argument that if we were to increase rents, increase property taxes, those would be passed on to renters. And it is an in-between area, but I have in all these discussions, and this gets back to the question about Joel Fox, residential versus the way I would phrase it is non-residential property shall be periodically reassessed. Now, it may be non-residential land, if it come down to it, should be periodically reassessed. But that question highlights that area. You can say, well, big apartment owners, they're changing ownership. They can use some of those same loopholes. On the other hand, commercial, renters don't have many of the advantages that homeowners have. So the discussion has always been in terms of, at least as I've tried to frame it and others, non-residential property.
It's mixed use, you understand that?
No, there is.
And mixed use, and then you have Costa-Hawkins, which means that it's completely exempt for new construction, but I respect and admire your research. But Costa-Hawkins exempts it for new construction completely, and on mixed use, you're going to have the same thing. But I say you're right.
No, I agree. We looked at the numbers on mixed use, and they're like 3% of the roll, very, very small.
Yeah.
3% of the what?
Roll.
Tax roll. Of the tax roll.
But it's growing, and so the question is right. In transportation corridors, people are now being encouraged to do mixed-use housing and commercial use. What is that answer?
Well, my hope, and I'm way too rational, is that if we do our work in research and the organizing we've been talking about, that there will be a discussion. There is no question there will be a discussion in the state about tax reform starting in 2015, and that discussion is in large part because Prop 30, the sales tax ~$0.25 is going to expire end of 2016. The tax on the rich will expire a couple of years later. And maybe we'll say just continue that, but there will no doubt be a tax reform discussion. The hope is to get this to the level where you really can. It's not like we're going to go all out and everybody's going to kill each other on the ballot. To really have a serious discussion which can really deal with some of the subtleties and the nuances and all those issues and say, okay, how are we going to define this? What will we do with it? And I do think, for example, when I've talked recently to business folks, the high-tech community hates what's called the business personal property tax. It's a tax on equipment. And Intel will get it, or Apple will get a new piece of research equipment, and the assessors say, oh, we got to depreciate that over 10 years. Intel says, Moore's Law, it's only useful for about 2 years. We ought to depreciate it right away and not pay tax on it anymore. So they fight like hell. It's there's a whole issue of what's called embedded software, where according to 1971 statute, you can't really tax the software value of a piece of machinery. So what's it worth now? The software. So there's a huge fight. I would say get rid of that tax and almost the simple, most rational part of that is tax the underlying land, but don't tax the equipment. And so I'd love to have a real rational discussion, and then when you're playing that out, let's talk about, you have an environment in which to talk about mixed use, for example, and how we encourage smart growth with a smart role.
This is a really simple question. I know that one of the arguments about doing property tax reform is that our whole tax system in California is way too dependent on income tax revenue, in contrast to most states where it's more stable because most of their tax revenue is based on property tax revenue. I'm just wondering, do you have just kind of the general gist of what that contrast is, and why does it matter?
You want me to okay, I'm sorry. I don't mean to hog the microphone. The income tax issue, and this is particularly what was said about taxing the rich, which we did in Prop 30, is that capital gains are very volatile. And so at the end of 1999, 2000, we had all this extra revenue. In 2001-2, it crashed because the capital gains of the dot-com bubble had built up. Well, and it was interesting because I thought that was really a one-in-a-lifetime event. It was a real bubble, but we saw another bubble by 2007. Although it was a different kind of bubble. But that gets to the question of the volatility of the income tax, and particularly as you depend on wealthy taxpayers whose incomes, you know, they may all stay high, but they could be very high or less than that high. And so the property tax is exactly as you said it. It's in most tax systems, it's a very stable tax. It is a stable tax the way it's set up now in California, but it's stable and very low. So the result is really a problem of local finance. For the county of Los Angeles, virtually their only discretionary revenue, and they got to do sheriffs and jails, so it's not even that discretionary, but the bulk of their discretionary revenue is property tax. For cities, it's a share of the sales tax and the property tax. So a low, and it's stable, but it's low. So if you can replace some of the more volatile tax with a more stable tax, you know,
And
it's better.
I was trying to get my memory about what do most states have as a percentage of how much of their overall revenue is property and how much of it is in California.
You know, I should know that. We do have a pretty, you know, California actually between they talk about sales income and property as having a diversified base, and we do have a relatively diversified base compared to a bunch of other states.
I happen to be a commercial property owner who believes also there's inequities in the system and reforms necessary.
Can I sign you up?
The assessor's office is already
He's the only one. Get it.
But I also, as a commercial property owner, see the dangers and the pitfalls to the industry and to the economy by potentially destabilizing property values, which you can do. The higher taxes have to do one of two things. They either have to get passed through to commercial tenants, or they are paid by the property owner, which means that the value of the property goes down because the net operating income of the property goes down. So, have you, a couple questions. One, in your research, have you looked at or do you plan to look at the impacts of various tax schemes on assessed values, as well as looking at the rates? And the second question is, have you considered possibly a way of, you talked about stability, and stability is critical to the function of the economy. Capital loves certainty, right? People don't invest in things that are too risky. So have you looked at the possibility of a catch-up plan? For example, rather than, for example, raising the cap of 2% annual increases per year to maybe 3%, or possibly even a surcharge on that for properties that haven't been reassessed in X number of years or decades?
Well, those are two different things, because if you say we've got Intel's $800 an acre and Yahoo's $45,000 an acre, and Intel gets so we change it from 2 to 3%. They get an $80 increase. Yahoo gets a $450 increase. So by percentage, it's the same. But once you start building a percentage change on those huge inequities, you make it worse, actually. And people have said, well, why don't we just split the rate, 1% for homeowners, 2% for commercial, same problem. The phase-in, the catch-up, those are all ways I think we can have a good conversation. I also, here was when you said you're lowering property value. If you just think about the land alone, and because I really think that is getting closer to a solution. I was on the Tax Reform Commission that Jennifer was on. I was asked by Michael Boskin, who was first Bush's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, who was a member of that. He said, well, don't you think that you're not going to get as much money as you think in tax revenue because you will lower value? Now that's, for the property owner, that's good, because you may get full market, but it lower it. My response was that if you lower the value of land, then you've freed up, then that is probably the best thing you could do for the investment in the economy, because the land is kind of the feudal system. All the value is in land. We want it in capital and labor. So at the same time as perhaps your land value is lowered, and that may lower, your tax goes down a little bit. But at that point, the new investor is facing a much more favorable climate.
I would just say,
so you're right about lowering. You may lower that value, but if it's in land and not in the building and the property.
But I would posit with you that a great deal of the value really, and more of the value really comes from the rental stream that's generated by the improvements than the land, because the assessor's office as well as private appraisers use the income approach most typically to assessing value.
Hi, thank you. I just have a very brief comment and question.
A little louder, please.
I'm just glad that you all are doing this. It's the first SMC event that I've been to, and I hope that we can get more young people, involved in this and aware of what Prop 13 is. I'm surprised at how many people I speak with who don't even know what Prop 13 is and what the implications are, and whether they realize it or not. They do have a vested interest, whether they're property owners or not. So thank you for holding this. And my question is, in regards to the projections of, if you were able to implement some of the solutions you presented tonight, are there projections yet, even, rough estimates that indicate what this type of reform to commercial property tax would do in terms of proportion of property taxes in relation to income tax and sales income tax and the progressivity of the tax code, and also the proportion that the commercial properties would pay as opposed to the residential? Are we trying to get back to that 50-50 mark, or?
Well, it varies county by county. So whether it's 50-50, you will get ongoing growth that more accurately reflects the real values of housing and commercial. Right now, we raise about $43 billion in property tax, closer to 58 or 60 in income tax. This would bring property tax, which again is cities, counties, and schools, up by about $10 billion.
I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight. Please thank our panel.